Hi, everybody. Welcome to the second episode, part A and a half of the Anatomy and Physiology series. My name is Ridhi Sreenivas, and today we're going to be talking about glandular epithelium. So, if you didn't watch part A, I will link it in the comments down below for sure. So, feel free to check that out whenever you can, as I cover epithelial tissue in general. But today, I'm kind of going to move into this category of epithelial tissue that we kind of touched on a bit, but I didn't get the chance to go too much in depth because it's pretty complicated and there's just a lot in it. So that is what I'm going to devote this video to completely. But let's kind of recap a little bit. So a tissue, again, is a group of the same type of cells that work together to carry out a certain function. So kind of what we're talking about today is glandular epithelium, and that is the type of tissue that glands are made of. Now, what are glands? Glands are organs that secrete substances in general, but they can secrete substances into an internal or an external environment, which we're going to be talking about a bit today. So, there are two categories of glands, endocrine and exocrine glands, but some glands can do both or can produce both endocrine and exocrine secretions. So a gland can either be an endocrine gland, an exocrine gland, or can be able to do both, have a combination of being able to do both, but we're not going to be talking too much specifically about those glands in this video. And, we're not going to be talking just too much specifically about them. Those sort of things will come in later videos, probably when we talk about the endocrine system. But I'm going to leave you with some examples here just to get you thinking. So an example that does both secretions is the pancreas. The pancreas, the liver, and the gonads, or the reproductive organs. But let's kind of just dive a little bit into endocrine glands first. So, endocrine glands make endocrine secretions, which are hormones that are released directly into the bloodstream, into an internal environment, going directly into the bloodstream. Now, what are hormones? Let me just actually write that down. Okay, hormones. What are those? What do they do? So they're basically these chemical signals that trigger something to happen to overall regulate the functions of the tissues, organs, organ systems, and in total, the human body. So it's really just going to help with regulation, but it's going to trigger something that's going to help regulating. And we're going to probably discuss a lot more about this sort of stuff when we move into the endocrine system. But endocrine glands are composed of endocrine cells. Pretty straightforward, I think. But yeah, we're not going to get too much into endocrine glands this video, sadly. We're going to probably get into that a little bit in the future, but I'm going to leave you with some examples here. So an example, and a lot of examples are right here in this picture. So one is the adrenal glands on the kidneys, another is the pituitary gland in the brain, hypothalamus, pineal gland. These are all endocrine glands. But we're going to talk a lot more about this in coming videos. But today's focus is mainly on exocrine glands. So exocrine glands, on the other hand, make exocrine secretions, which are released onto an epithelial surface. That's why they kind of a little more correlated with today's video, because we already learned about epithelial tissue, just a little more correlation, and that's why we're not going to get too much into endocrine ones today. Although all glands are made of glandular epithelium. But yeah, this is another way that you can kind of classify between or differentiate between exocrine and endocrine glands, is because exocrine glands can be released, their fluids can be released onto an internal or an external surface. For endocrine glands, it's only into the bloodstream, which is an internal area. So important to note that. And another thing to note is that exocrine glands release their secretions through ducts. Now, what are ducts? They're these tubes that allow the fluid to exit the gland to go wherever they need to. Now, why did I bring this up? That's because endocrine glands don't have ducts to release their fluids. And therefore, endocrine glands are also referred to as ductless glands. So that's just another way you can differentiate between the two types. And let me kind of just go into a few examples right now of exocrine glands, you kind of have a good idea. And I'm not going to refer to specific types of exocrine glands because I feel like those are less widely known and easier to see. I mean, they're less easier to see and less widely known compared to all of these endocrine glands. So I'm just going to give you guys some examples of some exocrine secretions, and that includes, those tears that are produced from your eye area, sweat that comes from your skin, or milk that comes from the mammary glands. Those are all exocrine secretions. Now, that's where we're going to get really specific into today's video, but now we also need to learn how to classify the different types of exocrine glands. So the same exocrine gland that secretes sweat won't also secrete milk. So what are the different ways we can just kind of classify here? There are three kind of categories, I guess, or things to look for. So there's the structure of the glands, what is the product or substance that is being secreted, and how does the gland secrete their substance or fluids, the method of secretion, how does it do it? So let's first look into structure of glands. So they can either be unicellular or multicellular. Unicellular glands are these individual cells that secrete substances, and an example includes mucus cells, which secrete mucin, while multicellular glands are groups of cells that produce those secretions. And an example are the salivary glands. Remember, unicellular is one cell, individual, just one, and multicellular refers to many. So unicellular, one cell, individual cells, multicellular, many cells, groups of cells. But for multicellular glands, there are three subcategories that classify the type of multicellular exocrine gland. The first being the structure of the duct, next the shape of the secretory unit or portion of the gland, and the relationship between the ducts and the glandular areas. And I'll show you guys some diagrams in a bit of all these characteristics so it makes a little more sense, and I'll kind of explain as we go. But first, let's kind of just get a good idea of all these terms. So first, when we're looking at the structure of the duct, it can either be simple or compound. Simple is when it has one singular duct, very simple. Compound is when there are just multiple divisions that are coming off of the duct. And I'll show you guys a picture of that in a bit. Now, if we look at the shape of the secretory unit or portion of the gland, the shape can either be divided into tubular, alveolar, also called acinar or acinar, or it can actually be a combination of both, something called a tubulo-alveolar or a tubular acinar. So tubular, let's look at this one, refers to glandular cells being formed into, tube-like structures that can either be straight or coiled. Let me kind of, should I write this down? Let's do that. straight or coiled. Okay, so it can either be either one, but if we look at alveolar, it kind of looks, these kind of shapes will look like alveoli, which are these tiny air sacs in the lungs. That's kind of just how, like, I remember it, but it also, if you are new to anatomy and physiology, which you probably should be if you were into my series, if you're new, the shape of alveoli kind of looks like a balloon. I can't draw, but like something like that, Looks kind of like a balloon. Kind of has like this balloon-like shape, except with the string attached. Like, yeah, so no string attached, but kind of this shape is what an alveoli looks like. And glands and these multicellular glands can also be a combination of both. And I'll show you guys, can have a combination of both of these sort of structures, and I'll show you guys that image in a minute. But let's look at the third and last classification for multicellular exocrine glands, and that is relating to the ducts and glandular areas. And so it's pretty simple. So if there are multiple secretory glandular areas in the gland that share a duct, these glands are considered branched. Now, let's look at a bit of a diagram right here. And I'm kind of going to explain this a bit. So tubular, simple tubular, just one duct right here. One singular duct right here. And tubular having that like tube-like shape. Simple. And you don't have to say, you don't have to say that, if it's a straight tubular, if it's a straight tubular gland, you don't have to add straight into there because it would probably be assumed that already. But if it's coiled, you would have to say, yep, it is coiled because it's not assumed initially. So simple coiled tubular, and then simple branched tubular. And what that is it's having those multiple kind of like branchings coming out. There are multiple areas that share the same duct, branched in tubular shape, but still coming from a single duct up here. Next is the simple alveolar shape, balloon shape. Then there's the branched version. And now when we move into complex glands, you may be wondering why the word branched isn't there, and that's because compound glands are already assumed to be called branched. They're already assumed that, so you don't need to write that. That doesn't need to be written. Because if they are compound, they already have multiple branchings, so we know they're already branched. So this is compound tubular, tube shapes, then alveolar, and then the tubulo-alveolar ones have some of those straight tubes, but some of those like balloon-shaped air sacs as well. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a visual, and some of them have some written examples right here, so you can just take a look at that as well. Know which glands are certain types, like Endocrine sweat glands are simple coiled tubular. So, yep, just says a bit about the different examples. But now, let's move on to our second main classification area. We went over the structure. Now let's look at how to classify the exocrine gland based on the type of fluid it makes. So there are 3 types: serous glands, mucus glands, and mixed exocrine glands. So first, serous glands, which secrete a watery solution that contains enzymes. So that's the type of solution we'll see with it. And an example are parotid salivary glands. I'm going to write that down. Next are mucus glands that secrete mucin that forms mucus, and an example are the sublingual, salivary glands. And last is the mixed exocrine glands, which can do both types of secretions. An example is the submandibular salivary gland. But now I kind of accidentally showed you guys this, but this is the last categorization we're going to be looking at, which is how the gland secretes its fluids or products. So there are 3 ways. Merocrine, which is the most common way of how glands secrete their things. So merocrine, apocrine, and holocrine. And holocrine is the most rare form. So first of all, we have how merocrine secretion works in these exocrine cells is they release the fluid through secretory vesicles through a process called exocytosis. I'm going to write this in a different color. So they do this by exocytosis, which basically transports the molecules of the substance by the vesicles inside the cell by fusing with the membrane to release the contents of the vesicles. And exocrine glands that do this are sweat glands in your skin called eccrine sweat glands. And we're going to talk more about this one when we get into integumentary system. But they're basically the sweat glands that release sweat in response to temperature. So it can regulate the temperature of your body. Next, there is apocrine secretion, where the cytoplasm of the exocrine cell breaks off from the cell, but the cell can regenerate that part. And an example gland that uses this method is the mammary gland to secrete milk. And last method of secretion is holocrine secretion, where the exocrine gland cell bursts so that it can release this secretion. But that in turn destroys the gland cells. So an example of this would be sebaceous glands that secrete oil, which we're going to talk more about when we get into the integumentary system again. But again, this is the most rare form, and this one is the most common. So those are the methods of secretions or the way that they can secrete things, and how we can kind of group each gland into a method of secretion so we can understand more about what the gland does and what are its functions. But that is pretty much the end of this video. And again, I kind of touched a bit about this kind of thing in the last video when I was talking about, how classifications are just very important to be able to tell what the organ does based on what we know about its structure. So classification, structure, and function go very hand in hand, and a way we can kind of bridge the gap is through classifying the different types. So, I kind of yapped a lot about classification in the last video, so I completely encourage you to check out that video if you didn't already. But yeah, that is pretty much it for this video. I tried to give you guys a pretty good idea, some pretty basic explanations about glandular epithelium and glands in general, more specifically exocrine glands. But if there are any questions or things you specifically are curious about glands, please feel free to comment those down below and we can definitely discuss it further. But anyways, thank you so much for watching this video and I hope you stay tuned for future videos.